Magic can be pretty expensive, but it doesn't have to be. Today I'm going to show you how to build standard Azorius Soldiers on a budget without sacrificing too much power. This has been a competitive deck in Standard basically since the release of Brothers War, and it's actually composed largely of fairly affordable bulk. Things like Recruitment Officer, Harbin, and Resolute Reinforcements are the most commonly played creatures in the deck, and none of them are particularly valuable. This is true for Lunarch Veteran, Zephyr Sentinel, and Yoshin Frontliner. You can pick up a playset of each of these for just a few dollars total. The most expensive creatures these decks typically play include Knight Errant of Eos, Werefox Bodyguard, and Thalia, and even these are just over $1 each, and the Bodyguard and Thalia aren't even that common. So what makes this deck so expensive? Because looking at deck lists online, they often reach upwards of $300, and this is largely the result of cards like Wedding Announcement, Virtue of Loyalty, and Wandering Emperor. All of these are very powerful, but come at a pretty hefty price, and they can really inflate the cost of the deck. There are also some lands that really hit the budget as well, the most egregious being Cavern of Souls, which at the time of this recording cost about $40 each, adding $160 to the deck's total. While these cards are great, we can definitely get a build of Azorius Soldiers going without these cards for very cheap, which will be perfect for casual play or just as a starting point if you want to start playing competitively at a local game store. So let's start with the 3 cards that are played in literally 100% of top 8 decks, and that's Recruitment Officer, Harbin, and Resolute Reinforcements. Recruitment Officer is an aggressive 2-power creature for 1 mana that gives us a mana sink in the late game to help us keep up pressure. Harbin is another aggro creature, 3 power in the air for 2 mana, and it also gives all your other soldiers flying if you can attack with 5 of them. And to help with that, we have Resolute Reinforcements, which puts 2 power on the battlefield for just 1 card. Not only is this great for adding soldiers for Harbin, but they amplify pumping effects by adding 2 bodies, and it can be bounced with Zephyr Sentinel to be replayed for more value. So collectively, these are worth less than $4, which is a fantastic start. Next, we'll add 3 cards that are played in over 95% of published decks: Zephyr Sentinel, Knight Errant of Eos, and Lunarch Veteran. Zephyr Sentinel has a lot of utility, a flash flyer, which can add power to the board at the end of your opponent's turn, which they aren't expecting. You can also rescue creatures from removal by bouncing them back to your hand. Knight Errant is a powerhouse. You can convoke your board when the battlefield locks up in the mid-game to get more bodies on the battlefield, and it's a big creature itself. Do note, however, that it's not technically a soldier, this is a knight, so it won't interact with your tribal stuff, but it's so powerful that 97% of soldier decks play it, and Lunarch Veteran is great against aggro decks, and even works well against mid-range decks since it can be recast from the graveyard. Once again, these are largely bulk. The Knight is technically $1.25 each at the moment, but we're still at less than $15 total. The final heavily played card we want to add is Make Disappear, a fairly cheap counterspell that is necessary to stop board sweepers. At best, this will straight up counter a board wipe, but even if the opponent plays around it, they have to wait 2 extra turns to cast it, so they can pay for 2, at which point, if our board's being wiped, it's no big deal to sacrifice 1 creature to save the rest. And if the opponent plays around that as well, then they're waiting 4 extra turns to play their board sweeper, which is exactly what we want. Having an aggressive creature-based deck that can play a counterspell is very nice. At this point, our total is pretty close to $15, but we now need to start making some budget concessions. We can't afford Wedding Announcement or Virtue of Loyalty on our budget, but fortunately, there are some powerful and affordable cards we can play in the place of these, namely 4 Valiant Veteran and 2 Siege Veteran. Let's compare Valiant Veteran and Virtue for a second. So the Veteran is a 2-mana 2/2 that immediately pumps your board, so it might seem better at first, but Lords are rarely actually good on turn 2. More often than not, you want to develop your board first and play a Lord on turn 4 or 5 to get a surge of power. The Virtue puts a 2/2 out with its adventure, and then after turn 5, will dish out a +1/+1 counter on all of your creatures every single turn, plus it survives board sweepers if the opponent wipes out creatures. The enchantment stays on the battlefield to pump up future creatures, and this is why a lot of people have dropped cards like Valiant Veteran. In fact, With Virtue, Wedding Announcement, and Knight Errant, the deck is actually pretty crowded with non-soldiers, so there's less focus on playing lords and tribal payoffs and just getting outright power. But on a budget, we're going to play these two instead. The Valiant Veteran is a lord that can dish out counters from our graveyard, and the Siege Veteran puts out a counter every turn and will make a token whenever a non-token soldier dies. Both of these are bulk rares. They haven't seen as much play as they used to, so they only add about $2 to our total cost. I also want to add 2 Yoshin Frontliners and 1 Warden of the Inner Sky. Yoshin Frontliner was heavily played when the deck first released, but has fallen off quite a bit in recent months, but it'll do for us. And the Warden is a new card that can tap things to get counters, and then if it has 3 or more, it gains Flying and Vigilance. Some decks are playing the full 4 copies of these. I find it a little hard to sustain multiples of them, but I suppose after they get Vigilance, that helps add counters to future copies, so it's not terrible, but for us, we'll stick with 1. Now we need to talk about the mana base. This is an aggro deck, so we want to avoid lands that enter tapped. The good news is we have a few lands that are very budget friendly, including Fortified Beachhead, Secluded Courtyard, and Seachrome Coast. The first enters untapped if you reveal a soldier. The second can tap for any color if we name soldier, and Seachrome Coast is a fast land. Most competitive decks don't play Secluded Courtyard, but Cavern of Souls are $50 each, so we'll stick to our 25-cent courtyards, I think. The fast land is a little pricey, but I think $10 for a playset of this dual land is definitely worth it, especially since this is playable in Pioneer and Modern, so it's a worthwhile investment in my opinion. I also think it's probably worth it to add 4 copies of a Darkar Wastes. These are nearly $5 each, but our deck total is so low that I do think it's worth spending $15 to $20 on these. However, if this is too expensive, feel free to use basics. Just be sure to not add budget tap lands, as they will definitely cost you games for sure. And lastly, we'll play 5 plains and 3 islands to round out the mana base. Briefly going over the sideboard, we're going to play 2 each of Lantern Flare, Elspeth's Smite, and Destroy Evil. These are all removal spells with different uses. The Flare is great against opposing aggro decks. The Smite exile, so it's great for things like Squee for example, and Destroy Evil blows up big creatures as well as enchantments. We'll also play 2 Cathar Commandos as a budget alternative to Lauren. It blows up artifacts, it's an aggro creature, it's a soldier, and it's only 40 cents, whereas Lauren is $6, so, you know, we're paying 80 cents instead of 12 bucks for this, for a sideboard card. But yeah, that's what you want to upgrade into eventually. We'll also play Surge of Salvation and Protect the Negotiators for protection. Surge protects our board with hexproof, and Protect the Negotiators is a counter spell with a kicker that makes a soldier token. Both of these are very heavily played in these sideboards. And we'll also play 2 Takesia's Welcome, which are critical against aggro decks. If you can resolve it, you draw an extra card, which is perfect if your opponent is playing 1-for-1 removal. If your opponent's just like, you know, playing a removal spell, this really makes it difficult for them to win. And yeah, that's our deck. While prices change constantly, my current total at the time of this recording is about $65, and we still have a lot of the raw power of a traditional soldier deck. This should be a very cheap way to get into standard if you're looking for a deck. It can serve as a starting point if you're interested in building the full-blown meta deck, and if you're a casual player, this is just a very solid deck for very cheap. So yeah, I hope that's useful. If you want to see more guides like this, let me know in the comments or leave a like on the video. And in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.